Look, I'm very sorry that I can't talk to you in person this year, but unfortunately both you and I have a prior appointment with the coronavirus. So I hope that you're all well enough to listen to what I have to say. As you know, when I talk to you career advisors, I usually do what I call a prediction check. How did my predictions go last year? Now, as you know, I did have one catastrophic failure. I got the election result wrong, but there are some things I got right. One of which was I told you that I thought Australia's reliance on overseas students from China was going to be a problem. Now, to be perfectly honest, I actually was anticipating an interruption in the flow of overseas Chinese students. I had not anticipated the emergence of the Black Death as a problem for Australian higher education. But it's certainly true that we have had over-reliance on overseas students. The budgets of many universities, not ACU, are utterly dependent on that fees, and that means a lot of Australian universities, and in particular the so-called sandstone elite universities, have holes of millions of dollars in their budgets, and that's something that's going to go on for some time and cause major problems in higher education. And will make it hard for those universities to continue operating as they have. Now, that's not a problem for ACU. We have a relatively limited international student market and a very limited market into China. Basically, we're going to face the two challenges that all universities are going to face, quite apart from overseas students, and they're really the things that I want to talk to you about. So the first problem, and I get a prize here for the bleeding obvious, is we're going to have to manage the coronavirus. And I want to talk to you, I guess, about how you might advise students about pursuing tertiary study, whether at university or TAFE, in the context of the coronavirus. Now, I say this, I can advise you, but things are literally changing day by day, hour by hour, but I'm trying to make this advice sustainable, lasting. And the other big problem or challenge in the Australian higher education system is that now that we have a capped system, the demand-driven system is gone, we face a situation where very quickly we're going to have more people wanting to go to university than can get in. How is the government likely to cope with that? What will that look like? And that's going to be a major matter of interest for your students because it will determine whether or not they can go to university. So if I could first turn to the coronavirus and universities, and I can try and make a series of fundamental points that hopefully have some enduring relevance beyond the next 3 days. One is, and I think all of you know this, that the coronavirus is not going anywhere soon. It's with us for months. It could last the whole year. In terms of universities, schools, enrolments, it's highly likely to have continuing effects even if the virus has gone and defeated in succeeding years. And universities are going to have to cope with it in the initial stage now, when society is closing down all sorts of things, and then at least for the next year, but with ongoing effects. And universities face two fundamental challenges in dealing with the coronavirus. One is they have to protect the health and safety of their staff and students, and the second is they have to protect the health and safety of their university. In other words, they have to protect the viability of the university as an institution. And the reason for that is there are all sorts of financial and other effects that corona will have on universities, and quite frankly, vulnerable universities, and that category does not include ACU, could collapse in the face of coronavirus. To take the most obvious example, if you're a university which had a high reliance on international students and your international students didn't come, and then your domestic students, for whatever reason, decided they didn't want to go to university, you would effectively be in the position of being without student income. So there's those two things, protecting staff and students, protecting the institution. Thus far, in somewhat garbled messages, it appears that governments want universities to stay, quotes, open. They want to do that as a sign of continuity, as a sign of social stability, that students can come back when this is over. And they also recognise that if you started to close universities, so they literally had no operations, no budget, no staff and no students, it would be incredibly hard to start them up again. You would see institutional failure, which in turn would leave Australia in a position where it couldn't educate young Australians. And if you take the obvious example of health professionals, nurses, paramedics, that of course would be disastrous in terms of the coronavirus itself. And if you face the fact that we are definitely going into a recession, what do people do during recessions when they can't necessarily get jobs? They will eventually want to go to education, whether in TAFE or universities. So keeping universities viable, keeping them open to an extent, makes a lot of sense for governments as well as universities. The vital point here at this stage is I think there's quite a lot of confusion. People out there in the media, and the media has not done a great job with corona, are saying that universities are closing. That's not true. What universities are doing at this moment, many of them, probably most, have paused their teaching so that they can take all or most of their teaching online. Universities are going online with their units, which is happening at ACU, and while they're doing that, they've paused teaching so they can devote all of their energies to that. Once that's over, universities will be open in the sense that they will be teaching online, their student learning and teaching support will be operating mainly online, and they will continue to educate students. It simply will be that the vast majority of education will be online. It's probable, I think, that that's going to last at least, obviously, for the first semester. It may well last for the second semester. The truth is that there probably will be some classes that will still continue to be delivered face-to-face, but I suspect that they will be quite rare and would only be where they literally couldn't be delivered online. So we're facing an online period of Australian universities. Your students coming out next year may still face that, and certainly the students who are in are going to be in that position. The crucial point is that all universities, I think, will maintain sufficient services to their students and keep necessary services open. So there will be the necessary degree of IT support, the necessary degree of learning and teaching support, the necessary degree of library support. There will be staff on universities, but obviously a massively reduced number. And I think that's the point. You can't run a university online without underlying support services. And some of those clearly are going to be on campus. We will still have some students coming on campus, going to the library. They need to be supported. I guess the important thing for your Year 12s is to understand that this type of situation is unlikely to be resolved in the sense that there will still be on-shocks and waves going into next year. I mean, at the moment we're facing the question of should schools close in New South Wales and Victoria. If schools close, all sorts of things will happen. There'll have to be questions about examinations, how people enter universities, and the truth is that we're in a situation where we're going to simply have to exercise maximum flexibility. So I think it's important that your students understand that, like everybody else, they're in a year of utter disruption, and that when they finish that year and are looking to go on to universities, they're going to have to accept, just as the universities are going to have to accept, significantly change things for a significant period of time. Universities are thinking about a whole lot of things, and I guess you're thinking about them. How are you going to do exams and assessment? How will universities select? Will it be the same way, or will the effect on schools that's being had now change that? One of the big problems that people probably don't know about is an obvious one. How do you keep teaching in degrees that have lots of practicums, of practical experience as part of the degrees, classically in all of the areas of health and teaching, but also in business and engineering. And those are things that you almost certainly can't put online. You can't put a nurse dealing with a patient online. And there's a bigger problem around that, which is that health providers facing their own tremendous difficulties are withdrawing practicums for fears of student health or fears of patient health. So the result is there's going to be, frankly, an inevitable mess in relation to a whole range of degrees, not just health degrees, but business degrees, engineering degrees. All of these degrees require practicums. And the reality is that the registration bodies, the universities and the students and the schools, and indeed yourselves, are just going to have to be in a very, very flexible position. Now that leads to the advice that you give to a student. If a student was looking at enrolling in a course where there was a practicum and they thought the practicum might be disrupted, what would you advise them to do? The advice that I give to my younger relatives is that they should certainly enrol next year in those courses for a whole series of reasons. One is if they don't, they simply go further back in the queue. Secondly, the degree simply becomes even longer. And the third point is a really important one. If we've got lots and lots of young people self-isolating for a long period of time, if we've got disrupted education, if we have a recession, the sooner those people equip themselves with enhanced qualifications to go back into the workforce when it bounces back, as it does, the better. And after periods where, frankly, they are going to be in a position of doing very little, the opportunity to actually study is probably going to be one of the most individually sustaining and socially sustaining experience that they will have. I think we should understand it. If we got into a situation where we had a student drought, where students simply didn't come to university, then you would have a major problem. Not only for the students, but that when they did want to go back to university, when the time did come, they might find that the significant number of universities that they were waiting for weren't there. So there's a whole question of continuity for your students, for your schools, for the universities, and we're going to have to work hard together to make that work. Now, compared to that scenario, the other thing in higher education, which is what we were talking about before the coronavirus came along, sounds relatively manageable, even though it's a fairly wicked problem. And that's the problem that, in fact, already we've got a situation where the number of places in university don't match the number of people who want to go. Now, you know why that is. We previously had the demand-driven system, which meant that any student who was qualified could go to university. Now that's being closed down by the government, technical term, capped. And the result is that universities are limited in who they can offer places to. Now what the government said is the number of places can increase in terms with line with population growth. But the population tranche that they've chosen is the population of people aged 11 to 60. Now, it may not have escaped your attention that most people who go to university are neither 11 or 60. They're bunched in that category of people between 18 and 25. Now, that demography is growing much faster than the demography of the total population of Australia. The Costello baby boom, not that I'm saying that Peter Costello actually impregnated for these babies, but he did encourage the production of babies, is coming into universities. So there is then a big gap between how many people want to go and how many people can get in, and the lines on the graph become quite alarming very, very quickly. So that's the bottom line on that. Your students should understand that in the midst of coronavirus, they face a potential starvation of places for university. Now, the government is not stupid, and it realises it's got a problem, and Minister Tian has been working clearly. He's been scattering breadcrumbs to see how people react to what might be a plan, on a plan to deal with this. Now, the problem is he hasn't got any money, and of course the surplus is long gone. It died with the bushfires, and now we've got coronavirus. And it's very hard to tell what happens in that situation. Does it mean that the government says, well, no extra money for places in universities, or does it do the exact opposite and say that the surplus is completely dead, people going to universities is an objectively good thing as part of a recovery from coronavirus and recession, we'll give money? We don't know. What's clear is that the minister has a plan, that he was working, I think, on rolling it out in the May budget, but the budget's been put back to October. So there's a question, will he roll it out as part of stimulus packages, or is nothing going to happen? Now, I'm actually on the advisory group for the minister, so I have to be careful what I say and make sure the only things I say about the directions I think might be coming are things that can be picked up publicly rather than things that I might know from privileged access. But what's pretty plain is this. One is that the government would like to put an emphasis on funding places for rural students at rural universities. That's a very good idea because rural students are disadvantaged, rural universities are disadvantaged, and the coronavirus is only going to make that worse. It doesn't hurt that Dan Tian is the member for Wannon in Western Victoria, the place where my grandmother's family came from, so I know it well. So you can see that if there could be, there would be growth in the regions. The second thing I think the government would think of would be outer metro areas. It's the outer metro areas where you have a lot of students, and particularly disadvantaged students, low SES students, who want to go to university and don't have the opportunity. So again, I would expect there'd be an emphasis not only on rural, but on outer suburban. I think it's highly likely that the government, probably especially now that the coronavirus has hit, is going to be interested in strategic spends. Does a university have a program that's really going to be good if it's rolled out in a particular place? Like our new campus at Blacktown, provide jobs, provide places for students. I think the government would like to fund them. I think they may fiddle around with what are called cluster funding groups. So as you know, you get so much money for arts, so much money for law, so much money for medicine. Governments have been talking about adjusting those to provide more money for particular courses and particular areas for a long time, and that's a possibility. And they have a strong emphasis on cooperation with TAFE and with business. The government will certainly be encouraging universities to be far more cooperative with TAFE. They'll certainly be putting money into TAFE and also encourage both sectors, the vocational and the higher educational sector, to be working with business. Again, the coronavirus is only going to make that more imperative because as we come out of the coronavirus, restarting the economy is going to be affected by positions like that. So that's, I think, what I'll say to you today. As usual, we're having the same old problems that we've always had, like selecting on the ATAR. God knows how the ATAR is going to survive the coronavirus. It may be one of its early casualties. And the other thing that I'd say to you is simply this. I'm giving this talk on a particular day. For the last 2 weeks, on every single day, things have changed. And I think that's going to be the new normal. But that's my view at this point, looking out. I think the critical point is that students are going to continue to go to university. Universities are going to stay open, even if for a time they're mainly open online. And that when normality resumes, it's going to be incredibly important that students go into the university system, not only for themselves, but for that system. And to make a very, very safe prediction, the demand for health professionals, for nurses, paramedics, OTs, speech therapists, I would only suspect is going to go through the roof. Frankly, as will teaching. Every year I talk to you about the extraordinary problems we've got in supply of teaching. I think the coronavirus is going to force government to acknowledge that. So it's nice to talk to you, even if I'm only looking at a camera, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Thank you.